All right, thank you very much for that. And thank you, Joseph, because I thought that was really interesting. In Europe, we called it multiple benefits, but I believe it's the same term. And we've actually tried to work with this concept or theme over quite some years also as VELUX. And the response that we've gotten over the past 5 years or so has been, yes, we know there's something around it, but we can't really quantify it. Or we can only quantify an nth of it, and then it's not interesting enough, or it's not valid. So I think you're really helping us out there with making it more tangible. Okay, so thank you again for the opportunity here to speak. I will actually start somewhere else, back in my hometown, Copenhagen, because this very week we have the C40 summit going on. So if I could clone myself, I would definitely have been there as well. It's obviously not possible. C40 is the world's largest network of megacities. It started out with 40 megacities. That's of course why it has the name 40. But today you have only over 96 of the world's largest cities that gather in a network, meet in a yearly summit of mayors, which is the one that's taking part in Copenhagen, and discuss climate change, and not least, of course, solutions. And the reason for why this is, of course, important is all the data that we've heard about urbanization, etc. But also because increasingly we see that our national governments have got difficulty in taking action. So we really need the cities, of course, to step up, and with the vast CO2 footprint that they have and the urbanization continuing to develop, of course, they have an extremely important role to play. I'm clicking onwards here. Yeah, that's me. That is just some of the things that the C40 is working with in terms of looking at infrastructure, of course, energy savings, new technologies, etc., etc. And of course, as VELUX, fortunately, we have some colleagues who are already there these days, and I will personally be there tomorrow to present the Healthy Homes Barometer, just like I did to you today, because we see, of course, this gathering of cities as a very important platform. I will go through here in the beginning a few points on health, and please excuse me because we have heard them a few times, but then I will go into what's going on in Europe on EU level, legislative level at the moment, and what that means for buildings in cities going forward. So what is actually that we can see what's going on. But maybe just first a fact. Which I think is very important when we talk about cities, because often our urbanization discussion, we picture these big mega cities, often, of course, in Asia, also in the United States, etc. But when we look at Europe, we can actually see that over the past 50 years, the suburbs have actually grown faster than the urban areas. So I think that's an important point, just to say that when we talk megacities, we often think of the high rises and all the big issues with density, infrastructure, etc. in the middle of the cities. But of course, the surrounding areas are of equal importance, and at least here in Europe, we can see that has grown quite significantly. And I know here in Paris, I know it's a discussion that's going on with the Grand Paris, I think you call it, the talk about that with the densification and the way that the city is spreading out, you get this large suburb area that melts into one big area, and that has to be treated, of course, as well. So the reason for people moving out into the suburbs, it's of course consideration on noise, it's on cost, and it's on air pollution. We see that very significantly. It's of course that they want more space, not least if they're planning to have a family. And these are of course all of the benefits that you're expecting to find if you move into the suburb. And looking at what buildings can do, and this is another, I'm sure you know this one, now you were a bit late in showing your graph, but this is just to show you that in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17, the World Green Building Council has also done some work on saying where can buildings contribute? What is the role of buildings? And I think the important message here is very much in line with yours, Joseph, is that buildings do not only contribute in terms of energy savings. Energy savings is the overall logic, and I'll get back to that and how that would look going forward. But of course, buildings play a role across a lot of the sustainable development goals and are absolutely crucial for us to achieve a more sustainable world. I think there's quite some parallels to some of the work that you do. So we've seen earlier also today, we have the issue with Europeans living in unhealthy buildings. We know that we can report poor health when we live in a damp home or a dark home. You've heard these figures extensively. I think that's quite well documented now. And of course, some of the issues that we see in the suburbs are, unfortunately, that you have issues with damp, with darkness, with mold, etc. So this dream of moving into the suburb and finding this green suburban environment, which is good for children, is actually not always the case, not least if you look at the indoor environment. And one reason for that is, of course, that a building, definitely if it's a detached building, it's got 4 walls. So there's more risk for having problems with mold and damp, etc., because you have just more facades. And there's, of course, a number of other explanatory factors. Another one could be, of course, that a majority of the properties here are owned. So if you want to renovate them, it's your own private money that you have to get out of your pocket, and that can, of course, sometimes be deprioritized for people for a lot of other reasons. All right, so I'll go into what the EU is looking at. What the EU is planning in terms of leading us towards, here up you see in the end, a fully decarbonized society. We've had in the EU the 2020 goals, now we're talking about 2030 goals and then 2050 goals. And the 2050 goal for the European Union is to be a fully decarbonized society. And I think the European Union is very much seeing itself, and with good right, I think, as a leader in climate change. And we, of course, noticed that our good friends and allies across the Atlantic seem not to be willing to be allies in terms of the green transition. So I think the European leaders have chosen to take this as a position. There is a new commission, of course, coming in. There's the hearings in the Parliament going on last week and this week. And already in July, there was the new Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, who gave a speech in the European Parliament. And if you haven't seen it, I can only recommend it, because in that speech, she sets out her 5 years vision for Europe in all sorts of areas. But of course, since we had just had the European Parliament election, which was very much a green election, she focuses very much on the aspect of the green transition, talking about a new Green Deal from Europe, for Europe. I know you've got a politician who talks about a new Green Deal for the States. So really strengthening the ambitions of Europe in this regard. Talking about already in 2030 that we should diminish our CO2 footprint with 55, maybe even 60%, which is actually very ambitious. But as you see here, this is a graph from the European Commission's plan here towards 2050. It's called Clean Planet for All. These are all some elements that we'll have to find our way through as European member states, and I'm sure you'll recognize some of them from newspapers or from public talk. It's about, of course, capture, storage of CO2. It's about network, interconnectors through Europe, etc., circular economy, etc. There's all these large and difficult and interconnected subjects that we'll have to find a way to deal with over the next decades. What is, of course, interesting here is where are buildings in all this? Because this is the main driving plan for the European Commission in terms of the green transition. And the only place that you can find buildings is up here where you see maximizing benefits from energy efficiency. That's where you have the role of buildings. So I think it's a key point here that buildings have been written into an energy logic ever since the oil crisis, maybe even before, but definitely since the oil crisis. And they will increasingly be so also looking forward. It will be an even stronger push. there's really a lot of good reasons for that. If we look at here Europe's building stock, you can see this is the classic EU energy label for buildings, and you can see we have a very under 10% of European buildings that are either A or B marked in terms of energy. So that's of course a very low figure. So definitely we have a building stock which consumes a lot of energy. We also know that in Europe it's only 1 to 2% of the building stock that's being renovated each year. So if we don't do something and start renovating our buildings, then of course we will have energy efficient buildings for many decades from now. And that talks about what should the optimal renovation rate be, and I think it's 3, maybe 4%, depending of course of the country, but maybe 3% as an EU average. So going further into energy efficiency and why it's so important, this here is a graph from the International Energy Agency, and they've also got some great reports if you're really interested in going into this subject. And it shows here over a time how the GDP has developed, how the energy use has developed. This is the thick blue line, and the energy use, what it would have been like, this is a dotted line, if we hadn't had energy efficiency. So you can see how energy efficiency helps to decouple growth and energy use. So energy efficiency has had a role over the past decades in terms of making sure that we don't spend more energy than what is necessary. This here is another graph, and I promise it will be one of the last ones I have. This is from my home country, Denmark. It shows that these millions are Danish kroner, so you'll have to divide by 7 in terms to get the euro. But it shows for a country like Denmark, if we're looking at the green transition here, out here where we are in 2050, this is the line here, the blue lines are the additional cost that our green transition will have as a country if we don't think about energy efficiency. So if you imagine a green transition where you only focus on creating green electricity, only greening your energy supply, but don't focus on how much energy you use, there will be a huge additional cost for the society. And this is of course something that lawmakers see. And the funny thing here, and then we're back to the co-benefits, that's actually exactly the difference between the grey line and the light blue line. So you can see there for a small country like Denmark, for us it actually makes a large difference in terms of how we're going to spend our money and how much we might have to raise taxes in order to pay for the green transition, and whether we're working with energy efficient buildings and industries or not. Looking at, are the EU member states fulfilling the targets? Because we've been working with energy efficiency for a long time. And you can see actually they're not. They're not working the way they should. This is back to a reference from 2016. And you can see you've got a number of countries all over here who are not fulfilling the obligations that they have themselves signed up to in Brussels. So you can see even with the current legislation, we are lacking behind in terms of energy efficiency and should definitely do more if we should maximize out as a country. Yeah. So, but then going into how do we then do this? And of course, it's large investments that are needed in order to reach that point. But and of course, there is talks about need of public money, so either taxpayers' money or putting taxes on companies, etc. But I think a key point that's often missed here is that we have to get the private money working as well. So if we have to do this only by public money, it might not be very popular to create these kind of massive changes that we'll have to do in order to reach a carbon neutral society. And if we look at private money, we can see there is a massive market for home improvement in Europe. So every year in Europe, they spend over 450 billion euros on home improvements. That's a lot of money. So of course it's kitchens, it's garden sheds, it's garages, etc. But it shows that there is a willingness for Europeans to keep on posting year after year a lot of money in their homes. And by the way, it's actually a figure that's been quite constant over the crisis. Of course, there was a slight dip, but it's been quite constant. So even during crisis times, people spend a lot of money on improving their homes. My point here with this slide is that if we have legislation or incentives, etc., that focus only on people saving energy costs, so only on energy efficiency, we're missing out on maybe one of the most important triggers for getting people to spend their own money. And to me, that is a paradox that we have inbuilt in our whole discussion around buildings, that we think that it's the savings on the energy bill that is going to make people spend a lot of money on improving and renovating their house. Because all research and also our own market intelligence as a company shows that people are at least as much interested in improving their health and well-being and comfort. So of course legislation has to take that into account, because if not, people will not spend their own money. So I think I'll end on the new Buildings Directive from the EU. The EU makes a new building directive every 8 years or so, and it's a mother legislation for all national member states. Of course, it's extremely important what comes out of the EU, and we as VELUX have been heavily involved in the process. The name of the Buildings Directive in the EU is called Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. It's not called Health Performance or Sustainable Performance. It's called Energy Performance of Buildings. So it is the logic for buildings is energy. That's it. It's the overarching theme and logic. And also a lot of the discussions that were going on in Brussels was, on one hand, how can we get buildings to be energy producers? Of course, that's been going on for a while, but how can we incentivize that, and what kind of renewables, etc.? How can we get buildings to become vehicles for energy storage? So how do we do that? And a very last discussion that lasted 4 months was what kind of requirements to new buildings should we put in terms of charging electrical vehicles? So the requirements that for every new buildings you have to have electrical cables put in or electrical charging stations. And of course, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with all that, because I think we need it. But it's just that logic which shows that the building is seen as a brick in the energy system and part of that, and not as much as important for people's health, their well-being, learning, productivity, all the issues that we have been talking about here today. So of course, what have we done as VELUX? We've tried to influence as much as we can together with other good partners, and we got a few points in the directive here around health, around well-being, about renovation, etc. And I feel there is honestly an increasing interest in the topic. So I think I'll end with this, because I think I've spoken enough, but of course...
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Could I have a round of applause for Ingrid, please?
Any kind of questions?